Right. See all of the attendees starting up. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Matthew Eby, and I'm the CEO here at First Street. And I'm joined today with Dr. Ed Kearns, who is our Chief Data Officer, to talk about the latest launch from First Street Foundation, which is our First Street Foundation WIN model, and then the associated products that we've created with WinFactor that's integrated with riskfactor.com. So thank you very much for your interest and your attendance. I will start running through some slides at the beginning, and Ed and I will go back and forth. Some quick housekeeping items. If you have a question, please put it into the chat. We will have either Ed or myself or Dr. Bradley Wilson, who was one of the modelers that built the WIN model, or Sarah Chadwick from our team, create the questions and answers. We'll be able to answer them on the fly. If you like a question, upload it. We'll make sure we get to it. And then at the end of this, we'll have a recording of the session. We'll send it out along with the answers to questions we may not have gotten to, so everyone can see that. But with that being said, we'll kick off, and I'll start sharing screen on the slides. And we'll go from there. So starting off with WinFactor, the first thing that we know at a high level is that tropical cyclones are becoming more intense. So using research from Dr. James Cosson, we can see that in the North Atlantic, the historic observations of hurricanes and looking at their intensities, that in the 1980s, about just over 10% of events were major hurricanes on average. So that being a category 3, 4, or 5. And then over time, as the atmosphere has warmed and the sea surface temperatures have warmed, we see that that number is now just above 40%. So if a hurricane forms, the odds of it being a major hurricane have increased dramatically. So we know that tropical cyclones are becoming more intense. And the other thing that we know is that they're changing their direction poleward. So they're latitudinally going more northernly. Ed, do you want to weigh in on our CMIP6 modeling here and what we're seeing?
Yeah, so to depict how these storms are moving further north in the North Atlantic, these results that you see in this slide are from Dr. Kerry Emanuel, who is modeling these hurricanes. The green line that you see is from storms that are not subject to climate change conditions. The black and gray lines are the storms mean latitude for those storms that are impacted by climate change conditions. So these types of signals are very difficult to tease out from the historical record. So that's why Dr. Emanuel is leaning heavily on the model results to show this impact. But these are the two things that we know is coming from the climate science, that we can expect storms to be proportionally stronger and to have a more northward track in the future.
And so Ed and I can both weigh in. Ed is probably a lot more educated to be answering on this, because he used to be the chief data officer for NOAA. But looking at NOAA's billion-dollar plus natural disaster list, which is generated by a gentleman named Adam Smith, you can look at the impact of these things over time. So if we look at CPI adjusted data, and we look at kind of the trend of these over the period they started measuring this in 1980 up until today, you can see obviously there are ebbs and flows, but the trend line is that there's more than a 400% increase in the last 3 decades from damage from tropical cyclones. And so we know that they're getting stronger. We know that they're now going to be hitting places that they typically hadn't at the same probability as before. And we see that with the damage that they're associated with as they're happening. And unfortunately, with all of these things being brought together, there's not really a great way to understand what risk is at a property level. And so the best way that we know of outside of WinFactor, which we launched on Monday, was to look at FEMA's National Risk Index, which gives you a score based on the aggregate risk and is based on historical observations. And so what you can see here from the NRI data on their site, if you look at Miami-Dade, which is one of the most highly exposed counties to hurricane wind damage, and you look at the county risk overall, you get a score of 36 that says it's relatively high. And then the expected annual loss is $26 million. That's based on historical observations. The exposure is 19 trillion. And then the frequency is 0.3 events per year with a very low historic loss ratio. So that's the level of detail that you get. It really leaves you with the idea that the county has some exposure, but it's not that risky, or historically it has not been damaged by that much, which from our perspective in our data tells a much different story, let alone when you look at an individual property and is your property built to the right standard, and will it have damages from wind gusts and things of that nature. So really, unfortunately, up until this point, there wasn't anything that was there that would answer these types of questions. And so that's where we like to think we've solved this type of issue, the same way that we have for extreme heat, for wildfire, and for flooding. And so what we mean by that is that when we release any of this data, we look at how do we build a model that can explicitly tell us the answers that we're looking for. So how do we build a model that can be at a resolution that tells us individual property likelihoods of being impacted, the overall exposure of that? How do we build a model that is open source and peer reviewed so that it can build trust in the community, but also be built off of decades of peer reviewed research that came well before us and can be continued to be built on for decades into the future? And then how do we do this for every property in the country? So not just a model for one specific area or one specific state. How do we do something that represents the same methodological approach for the entire country to give us a full picture of the risk? And then lastly, as we'll talk about a bit with our partners at Arup, how do we understand, given building characteristics, not just exposure, but then the consequences or the damage that may come from something like hurricane wind gusts or 3-second gusts to a building. So we'll get into all of that a little later in the webinar. So one thing that I'll say, and I'll pass it over to Ed to really go into our model, I mentioned this a little bit there on open and transparent. Everything we do, we publish, we put through the peer review process. We create a technical methodology document that we leverage and we make public on our website. And then we create reports on the results that we find that then give the high level understanding of risk overall. So these links here, which we can send out in our notes as well, are everything related to our flood model, our wildfire model, our wind model, which I'll update that to have now that we launched on Monday, our tech methodology, which is on our website, and our report. And then the peer-reviewed research based off of the synthetic storm tracks that we have that Ed is going to talk about in the next slide. And then along with our extreme heat model and our climate implications publications, which is a growing area of work that we're focused on with Dr. Jeremy Porter leading our efforts there. So I'll leave it there, but this is how we go about our research, and I'll pass it to Dr. Kearns to then take over on the model development, or Ed, if you have anything to say on this as well.
No, you get it all right with the open science. Yeah, it's great to work this way in this open and transparent manner. So to overcome one of the big challenges that faces any hurricane research, which is the fact that we don't have that many hurricanes to study, particularly major hurricanes. So there's been, for example, 4 Cat 5 hurricanes that have ever made landfall in the US, and there's probably been maybe 30 or 40 that have ever been recorded in the North Atlantic, right? So there's not a huge data set to work from, number one. Number two, when we're looking at climate change impacts on hurricanes, that makes the data set even smaller, right? So if you're trying to compare the last decade or two of hurricanes and their behavior versus hurricane behavior from 30 or 40 years ago, it is very difficult to do so with any degree of statistical significance. So one of the techniques that was pioneered by Dr. Kerry Emanuel, who also sits on First REIT's board of advisors, was to create what he calls synthetic hurricanes. So these synthetic hurricanes have the same characteristics as historic hurricanes, but we can create a lot more than within a computer model. So they have different tracks, they have different pathways across the ocean through the North Atlantic and making landfall. They are being pushed around in the model by the general circulation of the atmosphere that is also being modeled. So what it allows us to do is to create a whole lot more hurricanes that we can then study and sample. So we go from having, a couple of dozen hurricanes to study from the historical record to having 58,000 hurricanes. It's basically like all possible hurricanes that can be impinging upon the coastline of the US. And then we can start to statistically sample that. So this gives us much greater statistical certainty in the patterns that we're going to be seeing from climate change today, and then looking out 30 years. We can resolve both those impacts today, as well as what it's going to be in the future. Next slide, please, Matt. So when we take those 58,000 storm tracks, then we can start to subdivide the land surface in 10 kilometer squares, and we can start to calculate what the average and expected wind speed are under certain scenarios, what the likely wind direction is going to be under those different scenarios, and we can start to make that data really relevant to each individual property in the US. Next, please. So one of the things that we take into account for every property is the surface roughness around that property. So this really has an impact on what the actual wind will be at that building, at that home, due to that tropical cyclone wind impinging upon it. For example, if that home is on a beach next to the ocean, there's nothing to impede that wind from coming in at full strength and hitting that house. If that house is behind a stand of trees or behind other large buildings, then the wind will be broken up in a turbulent process, and the effective wind speed at that house will be a little less, and so the damage will be decreased. So we take that into account for every property. The other thing that we also recognize is that while hurricanes are classified by their 1 minute sustained wind speed. So if you say it's a 130-mile-an-hour hurricane, that's what you'd expect to see sustained within that hurricane over a minute. But that's not what defines like the threshold for damage. We know from working with the engineering community, such as our partners at Arup, that Matt will be describing more of their work in a second that we get to the damages from. They recognize that the damages are caused by the gusts within that storm. And it's typically quantified as a 3-second gust. So we convert our 1 minute sustained wind speeds from the model into a 3-second gust estimate, and we use that gust estimate to drive the damage calculations. So those are those whirling winds, those gusts within the storm that are going to be peeling back a rooftop or breaching a window. That's what we want to understand, is what that limit is. And looking at the engineering literature, on average, it's about 28% higher wind speed than the 1 minute sustained speeds within the storm. So we're using those gusts going forward for the damage calculations. Next, please. And I'll hand this over to you, Matt.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ed. So now that we have this hazard and we're able to quantify the exposure to properties, so that high resolution model that Ed was just talking about, that gets us down to the 30 by 30 meter pixels of different likelihoods or probabilities today and into the future under a different climate scenarios. The next question is, well, what does that mean for properties? And so what does that mean for different building types? How do we get to an answer that then says, well, you have a 1% chance of gusts of this that mean X for consequences? And that's where we have an amazing partnership with the global consulting and engineering firm Arup, specifically looking to answer that question. So we have looked at this for flooding, we have looked at this for wildfire together, and now we're looking at this for wind. And the way that this happens is that we take these 3-second gusts and we apply them to different building archetypes. So they've created over 56 different building archetypes that allow us to understand, based on the building characteristics, the impact that these gusts would have. So what does that mean? That means we're looking at roof types. So whether it's an asphalt roof or a concrete roof, or the different characteristics that would then apply to a gust actually potentially taking shingles off or whatever it might be. If we're looking at the year built of the structure, so under the year built, what building code would it have been built under? The number of stories, how tall is this building? The type of structure, so commercial building or residential or whatever it might be. And then two really interesting ones that came up that are specific to wind, one being a missile environment, which was a new term that I learned working with them, meaning the flying debris is much more likely in a high urban dense environment. So things on top of a commercial building are much more likely to blow up and damage other properties, or fly and other debris to hit another structure. So the likelihood of damage is much higher. And then a really important one, which is the actual direction of the broad side or the long side of a structure. So if you think of a home, and I'll show you this on our tool, or a commercial building, which way is the longer side of the structure, which then comes with it the idea of where would we expect commercial garages or doors, or what would the envelope of the building be, things of that nature. So with all of these characteristics brought in for each structure, which we get from the acquisition of different data sets, so tax assessors data and other purchase data that we get from partners like Lightbox that we acquire that from, we can then apply that to the appropriate archetype. So what we're looking at here is a one-story residential building with an asphalt roof in a high missile environment in Washington, D.C. The Washington, D.C. part is important because we're also looking at the costs associated with things as different parts of the country, the availability of resources or trades or things like that that would be available in different areas after an event. And so what we have here are two different curves. One is the financial damages curve, and one is a downtime curve. And so what you can see as Arup has developed these out to apply to the different archetypes is the gust speed. So that really important 3-second gust speed that Ed was just mentioning, and how we get our models to that. And then at certain gust speeds for this specific type of building, what is the damage that would happen? So if we're looking at this and we say, okay, well, roughly at 150 mile an hour gusts, 3-second sustained gusts, we're looking at an $80 per square foot damage on the 10th percentile. And on the 90th percentile of damage, we're looking at, $120 per square foot. And then we see it starting to flatten out as we get to certain speeds. Similarly, if we were looking at that damage turned into how long would it take to fix the structure at that same level of speed at that 150, you see kind of on the 10th percentile, we're at 200 days of downtime, and on the high end, we're at 400 days of downtime. So that's where we get the range, the uncertainty from the damage that we have associated with a specific archetype and the specific building characteristics that we have. So that's how we apply it. I'll show you in the tool later on in Risk Factor how we actually bring this to life for an individual property and allow you to adjust the characteristics to get to what might be an update that you're trying to make to a building, or to refine it to get to a different answer than what we might have as the baseline information. And so with these things together, we then can apply this to every building and every property in the country. So this is what Risk Factor is allowing us to look at. And I won't dwell on this too much because I'll actually show you the live version of this that was released on Monday for a specific property, but then anyone else can look at it. But with all of this brought together, so we have the overall exposure to all properties in the country today and up to 30 years in the future. We have the consequences calculated for all those individual building types. We then can start to look at these broad level impacts and look at the findings overall. So one of the really interesting things that I found, at least, is that within these kind of damage curves that we see, you really see a flattening with a majority of these archetypes at certain speeds. Meaning that if we're looking at downtime, you're looking at kind of once you end up in this 165 mile an hour or greater 3-second gusts, which is, as Ed was mentioning, the equivalent of roughly 130 mile an hour 60-second sustained gusts That's a Category 3 hurricane. What we see is that, really you're kind of rebuilding that building. You're flattened out on the max rebuild time. And you think about that, you go, well, does that actually make sense? A Category 3 and above, direct hit to a property. What historical observations do we have to validate against these damage curves and downtime curves? Well, if we think of the two most recent ones of these, we had Hurricane Ian, that was a Category 4 and destroyed most of Fort Myers Beach in Florida when it made landfall with those speeds to those properties. And then we had Hurricane Michael, which was another one that was a Category 5. Destroying almost every home on Mexico Beach that was exposed to that level of wind speed. And so these are things that we know are happening when they actually do happen. So one of the very first questions that we had as a group was, well, if we know that that's the case with damage, we know that at these speeds, we would expect to see this many properties, or the impact to properties as we have from historical observations. What are the synthetic tracks telling us about the probability of this to happen to cities across the country today? And what we're able to see is that when we look at the highest likelihood of being hit with a major hurricane this year, that all of the cities that are top of the list are in Florida. And this just goes to show a trend overall in the findings that we have in the report that we released called Worsening Winds. If you're interested in the findings and the details of all this, if you go to firststreet.org, it'll be on the homepage right there, an article on our findings, and then the full report that you can download. But the top 20 cities that are likely have the highest probability of being impacted by a major hurricane Category 3 or above this year are all in Florida, as I mentioned. So they're all ranging from 4.3% to 4.7% in an annual probability. And one thing that's weird about annual probabilities is when we think about them in isolation, they don't really tell the whole story. And what I mean by that is humans are not very good at math and understanding probabilities. I always joke that's why the lottery system exists, because we all think that we might actually win. But when you look at the likelihood of these things as a cumulative probability versus just an annual probability, so during something like a 10-year period. So if you lived in one of these cities over the next 10 years, what the math is telling us from our model is that you can have a 35 to 38% cumulative probability of a major hurricane actually impacting that city. And it just goes to show how likely these major events are to impact one of these cities over the coming years. It just shows how high that risk is for all of these cities that are all located in Florida. And are a trend overall, as I was saying in the report, that we found that Florida is by far the main driver of risk from wind damage in the country. It's 73% of all annualized damage that we expect in a given year for the entire country coming from one state. Ed, I don't know if you had anything to weigh in on there about our Florida findings.
No, just that. So I'm a Miami native, so hurricane risk in Florida is near and dear to my heart. But it is one of the reasons, honestly, why my wife and I had moved away from Florida 15 years ago because of this persistent risk. Anyhow, but yeah, it is when you see these numbers, it is very, very significant, and I do not believe that a lot of people that live in South Florida, in particular, really fully appreciate, particularly the cumulative risk and how much they're carrying every year. But this is part of the reason why we're creating these products, to make sure that people have access to this information and can make the kind of decisions that they need to make to keep themselves and their homes safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'll talk about this, Ed, if you want to just weigh in as we go on this. But one of the other things that we've found is that in Florida specifically, because we were very interested in Florida, we actually did a whole section of the report just given the sheer exposure that faces and the valuable real estate that sits within that state. We really wanted to understand the risk as much as possible there and kind of the nuances that happen within the state. And one of the really interesting things we found is that the Florida Commission on Hurricane Loss, which again, we'll send this out after and people can look at this, but they use historic hurricane landfall rates to understand the given risk to the state, and then use that to work with their modeling partners that submit open methodological approaches to calculating risk for the Florida Commission to understand how to price premiums and do all that things within Citizens, the wind insurance program that's run by the state. And so when we were looking at that, we said, okay, well, if all of these providers are looking at it and giving historical readouts of risk and using that to create CAP modeling and the probabilities of a hurricane making landfall today and the different locations of that, that's a much different approach than what we've done with our synthetic storms, as Ed was mentioning at the beginning, where the historical observation period and the amount of hurricanes that have taken place, there's just not enough to give you the actual confidence that you need in understanding the different probabilities of different events taking place. And so if we looked at the historic rates, well, how likely is a Category 2 and above hurricane to have made landfall or to make landfall today? Category 3 and above, Category 4 and above, or Category 5 and above. So looking at this histogram, we then compared the historic rates that are freely available from the Wind Commission to look at, and we take that, create this graph, and then we looked at ours and said, okay, well, what are we saying our risk is within the state of Florida for these major hurricanes or Cat 2 and above and to make landfall? And what you see is the first one has a delta of about 6% for Cat 2 and above, and they're nominally higher, just small amounts, but small amounts mean big things, especially when you look at this Category 5 section. And when you go from 4.3% to 7.6%, that delta of what would be a catastrophic event, a Category 5 hurricane directly hitting Florida, as we saw with Hurricane Michael and the damages there, depending on the actual location of where it hits, can have huge financial ramifications for not just the insurance within Citizens and the policies that they have and how they would actually pay out on that and the reinsurance, but just what that means for the state overall. So it's almost a doubling of the risk from what we actually believe it is from historical observations and what we're actually making decisions off of right now within the state. So it's something that we think really needs to be called out and pointed to. And then as you see with climate change and the warmer sea surface temperatures and atmospheric temperatures, we actually see that increase even more. So the delta between what the historical tracks are telling us today and what this will be 30 years from now is more than double. It's at 9% of hurricane events that would actually be a Category 5 making landfall in the state, which is just a scary thing to think about. Ed, I don't know if you have more color to add on that.
Yeah, and then the scariest thing about this, people that live in Florida understand that they have a chance of these kinds of storms, clearly. But the thing that really concerns me is the blind spot that can be created by the method used to assess that risk, right? And so, as Matt said, so using the historic method, you can end up with an estimate of that risk that is twice as low than what it really is, right? So if you know the risk, you can prepare for it. You can make sure you have enough insurance, or if you're at the state level, they can make sure that the Citizens Windstorm Program is properly supported, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of things you can do to prepare. And people in Florida generally, do prepare for these storms. But if you don't understand the level of the risk, you may not prepare adequately. So we really wanted to underscore, and as you can see in our national report, we have a whole chapter dedicated to the Florida question, because we want to make sure people are aware of this blind spot in the risk that is coming about, simply because if you're using a backward looking model, not including the impacts of climate change, you may be missing an important part of the story.
Absolutely. And so Ed, why don't you just keep going on this one, and then we can keep talking about it. But I think you do a much better job than I in explaining the strengthening of hurricanes and where they're impacting.
I don't know about that, Matt. Yeah, anyways, it's a great team here at First Street. But yeah, so this map put together by our visualization experts at First Street really puts together the sum total of the two effects that we're talking about. The fact that, number one, the storms that do form are going to be proportionally stronger, so your chances of having a storm be a major category storm with higher wind speeds is greater in the future with climate change. And the other part is that the storm tracks are going to be headed further north up the coast. So what this map is showing are those properties that don't have risk today from tropical storm winds that are likely to see that risk into the future, right? So you're seeing a lot of inland properties extending up the East Coast and into as far north as western Tennessee. So there are this is the effect of having the storms when they do reach landfall be stronger. As many of you know, when a hurricane makes landfall, it is cut off from its fuel source of those warm ocean waters, and it starts to spin down. But the stronger that storm is at landfall, the longer it takes to spin down. So if it's a stronger storm, it can penetrate further inland, and it can expose those properties further inland that have not typically seen tropical cyclone winds before, though we're going to be experiencing them in the future with climate change. And that pattern now also extending up into the mid-Atlantic and up to the East Coast. Not that they haven't seen storms before, but they haven't been that likely. They're going to be more likely in the future. And that's what this map is showing today.
Great. And so with that, as Ed was talking about, you can see that actual changing of area under the different return periods of properties that wouldn't be damaged, but now will be 30 years from now from that same event. It just shows the strengthening of these hurricanes and what they're able to actually do by making it further inland at those sustained wind speeds. Then the next question is, well, what do we see from just the absolute change in damage over that 30-year period? And so this chart is showing us just dollars and cents from where we would expect the biggest change in absolute dollars. And Jacksonville is at the very top, where they see from going from a $440 million average annualized loss, what we would expect to see on an annualized basis. Important to note that that means you might not have any damage for 10 years, and then you have a major event that's very costly. On average, what would you expect to lose each year from all of the distribution of probabilities and damage associated with it? So that's what the AAL is, that averaged annualized loss. And then how will that change in 30 years as you get these stronger storms, not necessarily more frequent, or the frequency of these storms not increasing, but the severity and the location of where they're hitting changing. And you see that Jacksonville adds 25% increase, or $108 million in today's dollars expected to be lost every single year on average with that, which is just an interesting point specifically to Florida, because what we're actually seeing in Florida is the areas of landfall are changing. And so those stronger storms are also hitting in different locations, as you saw with the synthetic storm tracks, meaning as they're moving more northern, as Ed talked about at the very beginning, places like Jacksonville have an increased risk, where places like Miami-Dade County, which I showed from the NRI data at the beginning, are actually seeing a slight decrease. They're still highly exposed and billions upon billions of dollars of real estate at risk within that county, but the actual likelihood of damage, that AAL estimate, is going down slightly overall. But for the state, the numbers are still going up, because it's just where these places are that are expected to be damaged, and the severity of that damage is what's changing. And then we see other ones in here, mostly southern states that are all around Texas, Florida, Virginia, and South Carolina, and Georgia making the list as well. So from an absolute increase, comparatively, this is what we're seeing with the increases overall. And then another way of looking at this is just the percentage increase. And so where are we seeing the largest percentage increase? Well, not surprising, when you take the really small denominator of places that don't really get hit right now, and then increase that slightly, you end up with large percentage increases. And this shows a lot more of the northern states that are going to be impacted in the future from these hurricanes that are stronger and making it latitudinally higher than they have previously. So still have states in here from Texas, Georgia, and South Carolina, but really a new set on Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and Rhode Island that are starting to make this top 20 list as a percentage increase of what we can expect to happen over time. So that is the high level kind of tables that we just wanted to look at. Overall, we're seeing 4 kind of discrete stories within different areas across the country. So in the Northeast, as I was just mentioning, we're seeing a large increase in the annual damages that are expected on average to increase 87% over the next 30 years. So those numbers are not astronomically high and then getting even higher, but they're starting to show big increases because of the damage that would not be happening previously from the storms making it further up north. Similarly, in the mid-Atlantic, that shift is actually allowing for an increase in the absolute wind speed at the greatest level that we see in anywhere within the country. And that actual increase, that 37 mile an hour increase that we see, is right on the Georgia-South Carolina border. So if you look on our maps in our report, you'll see a very, very dark color that goes right on the border there. And that's where we see the biggest increase overall in wind speeds, which then results in an expected increase of 50.3% in annualized damages for the mid-Atlantic region. Florida, as I mentioned earlier, it's 73%, or said another way, roughly 7 out of every $10 in wind losses for the country comes from the state. And it increases from roughly 13 billion to 14 billion over the next 30 years, which doesn't sound like a large increase, but when you're talking about $1 billion in losses every year, that is a very large increase. And also that distribution shift. So there's not coming from the exact same places that we'd expect this year, as it's changing over time as the climate's changing. And then lastly, within the Gulf Coast, we also see kind of the highest maximum wind gusts across the country, given the topography and the intensity that hurricanes can develop into, or cyclones can develop into there, with max speeds at about 248 miles an hour. Ed, I don't know if there's anything else to weigh in here on the overall impacts before we then kick it over to start demoing the wind factor tool.
No, I think you've hit all the high points here. Yeah.
Okay, great. So with that, let me change it up here, and we'll go from the presentation of slides over to the actual tool itself on risk factor. So anyone's able to go to risk factor, and they're able to type in an address and see the high level risk for any residential property. You can also create an account. And when you create an account, you're able to then see the advanced features and functionality, which are the maps, the damage functions that our partners at Arup created and we applied, or if it's a commercial property, you can create an account and use the free credit that you get to look at that commercial property and unlock that commercial property. So what I've done here is I've just pulled up a random property in South Carolina. As you can see, we've created in the past a flood model. We then created a wildfire model, then created an extreme heat model, and now we have a hurricane wind model that's applied to each property. You get a high level score, which is the cumulative probability of being impacted, or the exposure of it over a 30-year period. Some visualizations of the hazard. So we're showing the 1 in 500 flood event here, the probability of being impacted by a wildfire, the extreme heat layers that we have on the 98th percentile of heat. And then we also have the wind, as I was showing. I accidentally clicked on the heat map there. And so with wind, which is the focus of today, we show the overall score, as I mentioned. You can click on the report. You can click on the map, which shows the 3-second max gust speed today and 30 years in the future from a 1 in 3,000 event, a very unlikely event, the direction of the building, the estimated damage to repair, and then the estimated days to repair it itself. So I'll run through each section, and then at the end, we can wrap up and see if there's any open questions we might need to answer. But from a report perspective, when you first click on the wind report, at any time you can look at the top level navigation for wind. You can look at the wind maps or wind damages, or at the left side, you can see the different sections within the report that you can click on. But what we're showing is the cumulative likelihood of tropical storm wind speeds and above. And so we selected that because that's the low end of the Saffir-Simpson scale with hurricanes, and wanted to show those gusts to understand, well, how likely is that level or greater to impact the property? In Charleston, it's a highly exposed area. And so it's no surprise here that that lower level of winds is very likely for this property. So if you live there for 10 years, as an example, you have a 91% chance of seeing tropical storm winds to your property. Once you understand that high level exposure, well, how intense could it be? What would be the worst case scenario? So for wind, we've modeled multiple probabilities, or what are also called return periods, today and into the future. The most unlikely is the lowest probability is the 1 in 3,000 layer, which is really what the building code standards are built around for wind. And so if we have a 1 in 3,000 event, what that means, said another way, is if you lived in that property for 30 years, the typical period of a mortgage, you have a 1% chance of seeing this event to that property. So if we look at that and we say, well, what is the risk today? Well, it's 131 miles an hour that we would expect a 3-second wind gusts if that event were to happen at this property. You can see the darker colors over here, which would be higher levels of wind gusts. But as the wind events make landfall, they start to slow down because of the topography and the actual surface roughness that we include in our model, as Ed was mentioning earlier. And then 30 years from now, that actually goes to 150 miles an hour. So a different hazard layer. And I'll show you those maps in a second and how you can interpret those. Looking at then the 60-second sustained wind speeds, or the 3-second gusts that we were just talking about, you can then get a sense of what this is today and 30 years in the future, given the categories of hurricanes. So that Saffir-Simpson scale that we were talking about. So what is a 1-minute sustained wind speed for a tropical storm, category 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5. So what does this mean for this property itself? Any of these at any time, I should say as well, you can hover over the little info icons to get an understanding of what this means overall. And then we get into the property itself. What are the building characteristics? So could this building be damaged? So building, based on the risk of the property being damaged from a windstorm, is really based on the characteristics. So these are the estimates that we have for this property and whether there's damage from the projected exposure that we have within our model. And so these are all things that you can actually change on the building detail section to see what different outcomes would potentially happen. And I'll show you that as well. And then lastly, are there past examples? So our team took all of the historical, not just hurricane events, but also tornadoes, and looked at them and added them into our map layers so we can show you the historical events like what we're showing here, Hurricane Dorian, which occurred in 2019. And Dorian was recorded as a Category 5 hurricane. And then you can see the direction of it and the different wind gusts across the different layers. And I'll show you that in a second as well. But the estimated max wind gust nearby this property is 74 miles an hour. And then how many properties were impacted by that, similar to our other perils that we do. And then lastly, we have a community risk section, which is what's at risk for your county. The breakdown of properties and the number of risks that they have within the different categorizations that we have. And lastly, the section that we have before solution is why is this happening? So you can look at this within the impacts of warmer seas. What is it this year? In 15 years and 30 years, providing that energy to change the actual impacts of hurricanes and the strength of those hurricanes. And then lastly, kind of what you can do before, during, and after one of these events. And you can look at the solution section. So that's the report. Looking at the maps overall, you also get an understanding of the hazards that we've created. So this is one of our additional features after you create a login. As you can see in the top right corner, I'm logged in. But what is the current and future risk for an exceedingly rare event? We like to use language to help accompany the probabilities to allow people to really kind of contextualize what that means. So this is the 1 in 3,000 or a 1% over a 30-year mortgage that we're looking at. So this year, if that were to happen, as you saw in the previous, that's a 131 mile an hour, 3-second gust we would expect to this property. In 15 years, that would change to 141 miles an hour. And that same event 30 years from now would be 150 miles an hour, just because of the increasing severity that we see, because there's more energy for it to pull from. So you can zoom out, you can zoom in, you can see where we'd expect it. And as you can see, those flatter surfaces, which is just water area here as we go further inland, allows for the re-intensification of wind gusts versus as you go further inland, you can see it starts to lose those gusts or those power as the hurricane makes it further in. Similarly, you can look at, a 1 in 500 event. So a rare event, it's 122 miles for today. That would be 127 miles. And what you'll see is as we get lower in the probabilities, the actual changes that we see are much lower. So recentering back on this property, if we look at a probable event, a 1 in 100, which also has a 26% chance of happening during a 30-year mortgage, it goes from 100 miles an hour to 102, which is drastically different than those rarer events that are much different in strength and a lot more when the right conditions happen, which is less likely, but when they do, really changes it from 130 to 131 to 150 miles an hour. So that's the overall current and future maps. The other thing you can look at are those historical events that I was just mentioning with Hurricane Dorian that we're viewing right now on the map. So you can see where it started to develop, how it made its way through, and then what does that look like in comparison to the property. You can zoom in to understand kind of the wind gusts by color. And so it was just on the outside of the more intense winds that were in the middle of that within Dorian. Or you can look at other hurricanes like Hurricane Irma in 2017, giving you a good visualization of the kind of the wind count and where the impacts were. Or you can look at other interesting things like as opposed to just looking at the actual hurricanes themselves, you can look at tornadoes in the area. And so let's look at this tornado from 1960. You can see kind of where it started and the overall direction that it took. And then you also get an instant understanding of the Fujita scale and the rating of that, as well as the impact in total losses and damages. And so we don't just have hurricanes within this. On our historic section, we have impacts from tornadoes. If you're in a county that has experienced tornadoes, then we will have that in there and explain that. Or if you're in a county that has impacts from nor'easters or other wind types from thunderstorms that have that same level of impact or speeds that could impact property. So we incorporate all of that, but because the climate modeling is kind of uncertain on how those things are being impacted, we haven't modeled those out. We focus solely on the wind damages associated with hurricanes or cyclonic activity, I should say. And so outside of that, the last section we have is what our partners at Arup Power, which is where you see their big red logo here. Looking at this building, one of the things that I mentioned to you is, well, what is the direction of this building? Because that really matters for how wind damage is going to impact it. So what you can see here is that the building orientation is to the northeast. And so with northeast being the direction, you could change this if you wanted to a different direction, but we can see visually that the building footprint is oriented with that compass to then understand, yep, that orientation is to the northeast. So that is correct. I don't need to change it. And then we have the characteristics of the building itself. It's a residential building. It was built in 1905, the number of acres, so on and so forth, and the square footage, cost per square foot, and then the roof type. So all of these you could also change if you wanted. To see what it'd be like if I didn't have an asphalt roof and I went with more of a cement roof. That would change dramatically the possibility of this building being impacted, the consequences, the forecasted consequences. We then have the kind of damage by the probabilities, as you saw previously on the map, the same kind of concept here. What is the scenario? We're looking at this year, 1 in 3,000 event or 0.03% annual likelihood would mean 131 miles an hour. Give a little explanation around that. But then we have the estimated cost to repair, the days to repair it, and then the really important is the primary direction of the wind gusts. So now we're matching up the wind gusts, where they're coming in, what direction they're facing, what direction is the property, and then how do all of those things kind of come together in those Arup archetypes to then show the fragility and the downtime curves. And so we're able to look at this for what is that like today, in 15 years. As you know, the gusts are going up, which means the damage and downtime curves are going up. And then what is that like 30 years in the future? And you can see all those images changing with it and the damages themselves changing. You can also then change from a different perspective. You can look at what's called the parametric model, which is something we do for flood as well, where you can look at, well, I want to know my odds of a 100-mile-an-hour event. So you can see the cumulative probability of that. And then, so if I live there for 10 years, 10% likely I'll see that. And then what is the damage associated and downtime for that, or the wind direction. And then the last section we have is the average annualized loss. So for this specific property, what can we expect an annualized loss to be today? How is climate change then impacting that into the future? And is it increasing? Or what you'll see for a lot of properties is that some of them are decreasing because of the change in the patterns of hurricanes that we're forecasting with our synthetic storms. And so this property sees a 30% increase over time. And you can really think of this as a proxy for insurance rates. So would we expect that risk and climate change to then make the cost of insurance in today's dollars really go up, which is really important for commercial real estate investment, or real estate investment in general, if you're thinking about the net operating income of a big building minus the expenses to get to that, plus the divided by the cap rate to kind of get to the valuation, or the present value valuation. So what is that today? What that might be in 15 years, 20 years, so on and so forth. And so that's kind of high level what we have for the damages section, the report, the maps, and really risk factor overall as an overview. You can look at our methodological approach to wind is in here as well. A more simplified version of that. Or if anyone's interested in looking at this further, you can, as I mentioned, go to firststreet.org. And what you'll see is that we have now the wind factor is the main promotion here to search for a property, but right underneath it, we have highlights from our report, Worsening Winds, which you can download from here. Or the kind of press release associated with it, and you can dig into our technical methodology, which is on the site under our methodological section up there as well. So if you go into that, you can download this, look at the methodology itself, or see the full methodology link here, which will give you a link overall for the introduction, surface roughness, scoring, all of that stuff that we do in that open and transparent manner that Dr. Kearns was talking about. And we throw the mandatory calculation image in here so that everyone thinks that we're really smart. But joking aside, that's all of the findings that we have. I thank everyone for joining us today. Please feel free to reach out if you'd like to reach me. My email is matthew@firststreet.org. Happy to answer any questions or partnership inquiries or other things. And we'll be sending out the recording of this presentation. And hopefully we answered a whole bunch of them in the chat Q&A that Dr. Wilson and Sarah were working on. So if not, we'll get to those and we'll send those out as a package as well. But thank you very much for all the interest. We hope you found our report valuable, you find risk factor valuable, and we look forward to seeing everyone again in a future session. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and we will see you later.
Thank you.